we will be posting the recording, and we will share the link with everybody who is here today. And we will put it on our website. I am Alessandra Tanesini. I am a philosopher at Cardiff University, and I am one of the co-PIs on a project entitled Using Values to Increase Intellectual Humility Among Political Partisans. It is an interdisciplinary project between philosophers and psychologists at the University of Cardiff and the University of Bath, both in the UK. I am the person who is running the philosophical part of the project, and Dr. Henry Rowe here is also based at Cardiff University and is working with me on that part of the project. The psychological empirical work for the project is being carried out by Professor Greg Mayo, who unfortunately for personal reasons cannot join us today, out of the University of Bath. And some of the PIs, though, from the University of Bath on the psychological part of the project are here. One is Sam Taylor, and the other is Professor Laura Smith. And we also have Dr. Paul Annell, who is based at the University of Essex, who is also collaborating on the psychological part of the project. The project is sponsored by Georgia State University and Templeton Foundation as part of their applied research on intellectual humility. And we are very grateful to them for their support and their funding. This is the first talk of our online seminar series on virtues and values in psychology and philosophy. And we are very honored to have as our very first speaker, Professor Kristjansson, who is based at the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham, at the University of Iceland, and at Boston College. And so you might have found the ability to trilocate. He certainly has an incredible research output. He is the author or editor of at least 16 books and over 120 articles, plus many book chapters. He is, I would say, certainly one of the most preeminent, if not the most preeminent author of works in virtue ethics in the Aristotelian tradition. He has written several monographs on the topic, and he is also one of the most prominent philosophers of education. He is the co-director of the Jubilee Centre. We are very honored to have you. The title of Kristjánsson's talk is 10 Problems Surrounding an Understanding of Intellectual Humility as a Moral Virtue. Kristján will talk for approximately 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have a short break, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. Thank you very much, Kristján. Take it away.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'll just share my screen. Okay, there it is. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm not known for my work on intellectual virtues. In fact, I haven't written anything about any intellectual virtues apart from phronesis or practical wisdom, but phronesis obviously is a very unusual intellectual virtue because it attaches itself to the moral and civic virtue, so it's not sort of a standard intellectual virtue. So I was a bit surprised when Alessandra asked me to talk about this particular topic, but she said she wanted to get some people who are outsiders, who haven't been writing about intellectual humility before, and ask them to sort of give their view of intellectual humility from their own vantage point. So I will be speaking in a way from my neck of the woods, which is Aristotelian virtue ethics, mainly dealing with the moral and civic virtue. So how do we see intellectual humility And when she asked me to do this, I immediately thought about a quotation from Linda Zaksepski's 1996 book, where she says that all the intellectual virtues also have got a kind of a concomitant moral virtue or imply a moral virtue. So immediately my first thought was, well, what if we understand intellectual humility also as a moral virtue? And that is going to be my take on it today, which is slightly sort of needs and off the beaten track, but I hope it will be useful for some of you. Now, I'm not really an expert, like I said, on intellectual virtue or intellectual humility in particular. So obviously I did do quite a lot of reading before this presentation, but I'm not sort of as well versed in this field as I'm sure many of you are. And so I have to ask you to apologize if any sort of lacuna appear in what I'm saying, where I miss some important writings. But anyway, the question I got from Alessandra was, how does work on intellectual humility relate to the work that you've been doing? And that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, there are mountains of literature on intellectual humility understood implicitly or explicitly as an intellectual or epistemic virtue. I use these terms synonymously, although there is no shared understanding of its conceptual contours. I particularly recommend the overview by Ballantyne in Journal of Positive Psychology in 2023. I found it very helpful. And typically, I mean, Ballantyne is a philosopher, but he publishes it in a psychology journal, which is in a way representative of the field being very interdisciplinary. Now, I can't really pretend that I'm going to be adding much to this literature on intellectual humility as an intellectual virtue, especially considering the recent really sweeping surveys by both Ballantyne and also by Fennell Porter and colleagues in 2022. So broadly speaking, I follow those who see intellectual humility as a subdomain of the virtue of general humility, even if it means piggybacking on discourses about general humility. And more specifically, I will, in what follows, understand intellectual humility like general humility as a moral virtue. Now, notice I'm not saying that this is the best or the only understanding of intellectual humility. I think, obviously, the discourse on intellectual humility as an intellectual virtue is very important, but I'm just thinking, what if we see it as a moral virtue? What does that bring to the table? Any advantages or just more problems? So my roadmap is that I'm not trying to chicken out of a very complex discourse about to enter a smoother terrain. I'm not saying that the terrain of thinking about intellectual humility as a moral virtue is smoother than thinking about it as an intellectual virtue. Rather, I might be seeing to be going from the frying pan into the fire, because understanding intellectual humility as a moral virtue comes with a host of problems of its own. And I say surrounding rather than about, because many of those problems are not so much about intellectual humility specifically as about some of the broader conceptual terrain of moral virtue. And as many of you or most of you will know, I mean, obviously, there is no consensus on what exactly a moral virtue is or what are the components of moral virtue. And probably the two biggest paradigms today in academia is the positive psychological paradigm of moral virtue, and then the sort of character educational or Aristotelian paradigm, but there are huge differences between those. For example, in the positive psychological paradigm, there is no golden mean, and there is no phronesis as an overarching intellectual virtue, etc., etc. And even Aristotelians obviously debate among themselves what exactly a moral virtue is or implies. But anyway, I mean, my take on moral virtue is in this presentation is sort of broadly speaking Aristotelian. So I'm thinking about, if we try to understand intellectual humility as an Aristotelian moral virtue, what kind of issues come to the fore then? And I will explore 4 general theoretical problems and 4 problems having to do specifically with the presumed individualized golden mean architectonic of intellectual humility, if we understand it as an Aristotelian moral virtue, and then some practical problems about education and measurement. But first, a few clarifications. So to cite Zaksepsky again, she says in 1996 that any intellectual virtue is also a moral virtue. Thus, an intellectual virtue does not differ from certain moral virtues any more than one moral virtue differs from another. That the processes related to the 2 kinds of virtue do not function independently, and that it greatly distorts the nature of both to attempt to analyze them as separate branches of philosophy. And there was also a really interesting article in 2014 in Educational Theory by my friend David Carr on the difference between honesty as an intellectual virtue and a moral virtue, and he also, like Zaksepsky, found it very difficult to separate the 2. But overlap is not the same as equivalence, and I do not think it's possible to separate the motivation, and I do think it is possible to separate the motivation and focus of intellectual virtue from that of a moral virtue, although the same word, like honesty or intellectual humility, can be used to name both. So just to give you a really sort of brief account of what I see as the difference between intellectual and moral virtue, and I'm not saying anything terribly original here. This is sort of more or less a standard understanding in Aristotelian virtue ethics. Intellectual virtue is a multi-componential cross-situational character disposition motivated by an intrinsic concern with epistemic goods and aimed at epistemic targets such as truth, accuracy, credibility, plausibility, whereas a moral virtue is a multi-componential cross-situational character disposition motivated by an intrinsic concern with moral goods and aimed at moral targets such as human flourishing, harmonious social interaction, characterological development, etc. Also, quite an important difference is that in contrast to intellectual virtue, moral virtue has a medial form between excess and deficiency, the famous golden mean, which intellectual virtues do not have, according to Aristotle at least. So, like I said at the beginning, I mean, there are various paradigms of moral virtue around, not all inspired by Aristotle, and even those inspired by Aristotle differ considerably. I would particularly, for those of you who come from social science rather than philosophy, I would particularly recommend 2 great books which have come out recently. The 2021 book on understanding virtue by Wright, Snow and Warren, and then the new 2024 book, The Science of Virtue by Blaine Powers and colleagues. And those are both books written by an interdisciplinary team of philosophers and psychologists. And both draw to a certain extent on Aristotelian conceptions of virtue, but they sort of update it with all kinds of empirical evidence. So there's a lot of interesting new stuff appearing about sort of the architectonic of moral virtue. Now, many definitions of intellectual humility do not really talk about virtue at all, or just refer to a mindset or an attitude or even a personality trait, which I find a little bit odd, because obviously intellectual humility is not a personality trait of the same kind, at least, as the big 5 traits. But if you look more closely at the definitions, they all seem to sort of home in on the notion of intellectual virtue. So Alessandra's 2018 article talks about intellectual humility as a cluster of strong attitudes, and such a cluster can denote an intellectual virtue. And it's not a medial form between extremes, so not a moral virtue. And then Ballantyne more explicitly characterizes intellectual humility as he says that characterizing intellectual humility as a socially oriented mindset is a mistake, even if intellectual humility has salient social consequences. It should not be confused with the essential features of intellectual humility itself. So there are 2 ways of interpreting what Ballantyne is saying. He could be taken to be saying that intellectual humility is exclusively an intellectual virtue, not a moral virtue. Or he could be saying that essentially intellectual humility denotes an intellectual virtue. However, there could be a less common incarnation of it as a moral virtue. Now, I think he probably means the former, but for the sake of the present argument, I will assume and adopt the latter understanding, that there is a sort of a instructive way to understand intellectual humility as a moral virtue as well. And by that, I'm not saying that the intellectual understanding is not the essential or basic one. So I'm not the first person to hint at this possibility, that we can understand intellectual humility as a moral virtue. It's also hinted at in Porter's overview 2022. But I am clearly developing a minority view here, sort of exploring a side stream of research on intellectual humility. So my definition of intellectual humility as a moral virtue would be that it is the morally appropriate, that is the medial or the golden mean approach to one's own perceived quality, or you could say worth, quality or worth of one's intellectual pursuits. And when I talk about an approach, I mean sort of a cognitive or evaluative approach. We could call it estimation or attitude. I don't include in approach there any particular presentational features, because I think once we add those to the concept, then we have entered the realm of modesty rather than humility. So approach is simply there meant to denote sort of an evaluative or cognitive approach to one's intellectual pursuits. So probably my definition is closest to the one suggested by Greg and Mahadevan in 2014, realistic evaluation of one's epistemic qualities, although I'm thinking there about this in moral terms. So mine is a moral, not just an epistemic evaluation, and it's both about morally appropriate, here neither inflated nor deflated perception, and morally appropriate approach to that perception. So this sort of relates indirectly, although not directly, to Tannesine's two components of intellectual humility as self-acceptance and modesty, inner and outer manifestations. Although, like I said, I would hesitate to include the behavioral aspect as part of intellectual humility as a moral virtue. I think we need to add it when we start to think about it as modesty. So clearly my definition falls into the camp of humility as realistic self-assessment rather than low self-concern. And there's a very, very long debate about this related to both humility and modesty, the non-overestimation of self-worth versus the systematic underestimation of self-worth. This goes back to Bensier and Nguyen, and also even further back to the debate between Julia Driver and Owen Flanagan in 1989 and 1990 about modesty. So I'm clearly sort of in the non-overestimation camp rather than the underestimation camp there regarding humility. Okay, so it's time to talk about the 10 problems then. So it's interesting to look at intellectual humility as a moral virtue in the way that I have defined it, but it also brings with it various problems. Some of these problems are just general problems about moral virtue, sort of per se, in an Aristotelian understanding. Other problems are specific or unique to intellectual humility, understood as a moral virtue. I will sort of go through all these different problems. I mean, both the general and the specific. And the specific problems come from the fact that we simply do not have as much empirical evidence about intellectual humility as we do for various of the standard moral virtues like generosity or courage or justice or gratitude. So on my understanding, then intellectual humility as a moral virtue would be a medial disposition between intellectual arrogance or vanity on the one hand, and intellectual self-abasement or pusillanimity on the other hand, as the two flanking vices. Now, the first problem is, I mean, this is well known to everybody who writes about humility, that the ordinary language understanding of humility is much closer to the deficiency form. So sometimes in ordinary language, when people talk about humility, it sounds very much like a translation of what Aristotle called micropsychia, the deficiency. And this also relates to the Christian idea of humility as meekness, to Hume's account of the monkey's virtues, etc., where one is supposed to sort of underestimate oneself systematically in light of one's inferiority to God. Now, it would be possible to try to solve this problem simply by stop talking about humility altogether and replace it with modesty, but doesn't have this unfortunate connotation in ordinary language. But that would create another problem, because modesty obviously is public-facing. It's a presentational virtue. It's a full standard moral virtue with behavioral concomitants. So, whereas intellectual modesty is compatible with private overestimation. When I say that, I'm not saying that, I'm not talking about sort of false modesty here. I'm not saying that intellectual modesty is compatible with private overestimation because we can simply be falsely modest. I think you can actually be fully modest, or at least modest in a continent sense. You can force yourself to be modest when you're dealing with other people around you, although you deep down overestimate yourself. So you can, in that sense, you can hit the vice, the overestimation vice, the vice of excess, but you don't show it to other people. Now, the other solution to this terminological problem in ordinary language is just to give a stipulated definition like I did and not care about ordinary language. It's still unfortunate that the virtue seems to point towards a deficiency form and thus turn excess and deficiency around from Aristotle's schema of arrogance as excess and megalosychia as the medial form and micropsychia as the deficiency. Obviously, the excess of intellectual humility is not arrogance, but rather micropsychia. So like I said, I mean, problem one is maybe more of an ordinary language problem than a philosophical problem. I mean, everybody in this audience knows that most people who are talking about humility, they are thinking about humility as neither over nor underestimation, and we simply have to make sure to convey that when we are expressing our views to the ordinary language user, because otherwise we might lose the audience. The second problem is a golden mean issue, partly general to all moral virtues, partly specific to intellectual humility understood as a moral virtue. So the idea obviously is that a golden mean virtue is supposed to be exhibited or felt at the right times, about the right things, toward the right person, for the right end, and in the right way. So there are various variables that have to be collated: occasions, objects, motives, people, degree. Some of these are quantitative, like how many times do you mention your intellectual accomplishments? You have to hit the golden mean there quantitatively. But some of them are qualitative. I mean, exactly how you talk about them. What's your tone? What's the tone of your voice when you talk about your intellectual pursuits? Now, some Aristotelian virtue ethicists simply say this makes it just too complex and even absurd. All this sort of calculation of mediality with reference both to quantitative and qualitative measures. Other people like Howard Cursor, they stick to the golden mean architectonic, but obviously they make it very complicated. So like Cursor says, I mean, that for every virtue, there is only one way to get it right, but there are 4,000 ways to get it wrong. And he's not joking. I mean, he sort of actually gives us a list of the 4,000 different ways in which you can get things wrong. I mean, if you take all these different variables into account and look at how people can get the occasions wrong, or the objects wrong, or the motives wrong, etc. It sounds like a reductio of the whole idea of a golden mean, but actually Cursor thinks about this as a big advantage, because he says, I mean, educationally speaking, it just means that you just go through this plank by plank, you know, variable by variable, and you teach people to hit the golden mean for each individual variables, just like when you're teaching mathematics, you just begin with the simple things and then you gradually add more and more. And obviously this seems to chime in what Aristotle says about that you can be bad in all sorts of ways, but noble, only noble in one way. Now, I think the best arguments for retaining the golden mean come actually from psychologists, people like Grant and Schwartz and Ang and Tai and Morgan et al., that it creates all kinds of conceptual and psychological and even logical problems and paradoxes if we try to make do without the golden mean when we're trying to understand virtue. And I don't have time to go into this here, but my only point, the point I'm going to make is that I don't think the calculation problem is insurmountable if we have clear paradigmatic cases that we can point to. And we can simply adjust from those. We can point to a person who is the paragon of moral virtue X and say, well, actually, in order to hit the golden mean, just try to be more similar to that person in all kinds of different ways. So compared to the paradigmatic case of virtue X, person A showed a bit too little or a bit too much. But this leads to the problem of paradigmatic cases in the case of intellectual humility. So we generally solve problem 2, the problem of the various different variables of the golden mean, by identifying a paradigmatic case of the virtue being shown medially. So we point to the brave soldier or the cancer patient as examples of courage, the compassionate nurse or relief worker as exemplars representing compassion. And we then make subtle contextual and individualized adjustments to judge the fittingness of a person's actions, emotions to the paradigmatic golden mean case. And Aristotle actually says that if we can't point to a paradigmatic case, then what we are saying is just, what he says, is just theory. It's not really sort of a realistic assessment of the virtue. And then obviously we've got all these standard moral exemplars to admire and emulate, the brave Martin Luther King, the compassionate Florence Nightingale, etc. And Aristotle is very, very clever in his Nicomachean Ethics at giving us plausible paradigmatic examples for the individual virtues. We talk about Pericles, Phronesis, etc. There's only one example in the Nicomachean Ethics where the paradigmatic case he points to seems to be very, very odd. This is the case of Megalosuchia, where what he describes as the paradigmatic person who exhibits these virtues seems to be sort of said in a sarcastic tone, where he seems to be making fun of some of his contemporaries who might have been thought to be megalosuchoi. But apart from that, I mean, he's really clever at giving us these examples. And obviously, contemporary writings about moral virtue, they continue to draw a lot of examples. Now, the problem about intellectual humility, as I see it, as a moral virtue, is that I don't really think that these paradigmatic cases are very easily forthcoming. We've got lots of people admired for their intellectual acumen in spite of not being intellectually humble. I mean, Nietzsche in philosophy, Dali in painting, Robert Frost in poetry, Stephen Hawking in physics, not exactly intellectually humble people, but intellectually very much admired. And I think that it's not so much the case that we admire them intellectually despite the lack of intellectual humility. I think the lack of intellectual humility is part of the appeal of these intellectuals. So the intellectual sphere does not seem to be a fertile ground for humility, nor humility help define acting well or badly in a very discrete sphere of human experience, as Nussbaum calls it. So if the lack of a moral virtue is not seen as flourishing, reducing in these salient cases, we may wonder whether intellectual humility is a real moral virtue or not. The possible solution, we probably need to think of more paradigmatic cases of generally humble persons, for example, humble sportsmen like Bobby Charlton, and then transfer those to the intellectual sphere. But obviously there are obvious counterexamples in sport as well of people very much admired for not, although not being intellectually humble. So this is basically the first problem that is sort of, in a way, specific to intellectual humility as a moral virtue. Problem number 4 is the variance in the mean. So one of the more complications about the golden mean for Aristotle is that the mean is not always in the middle. For some virtues, the aimed for medial state is not exactly in the middle between excess and deficiency, but closer to one extreme. This is very important educationally because in character education, we try to drag students away from the extreme that they are closer to, like they do in straightening bent wood, as Aristotle says. So we need a lot of empirical evidence. We need a lot of empirical evidence about where the sort of the golden mean lies for each individual moral virtue. 2 examples Aristotle gives of moral virtues where the mean is not in the middle is mildness of temper. He says where the mean is much closer to meekness than irascibility, because people are more prone to anger than to being too meek. And he says that generosity is much closer to wastefulness than it is to niggardliness, because most people are too stingy rather than too generous. Now, there are no observations that I know about proper self-worth, but the mean may seem closer to arrogance than pusillanimity, because the people hitting the relative mean in Aristotle, the megalosychoi, are not exactly lacking in self-confidence. They seem to be closer to arrogance rather than they are to meekness. If we understand the megalosychoi to be the paragons of sort of humility and modesty. So is too much intellectual humility more of a problem than too little, or vice versa? Where is the mean? Is it in the middle? That's an empirical question, according to Aristotle's naturalistic methodology that needs to ground educational interventions. And as far as I know, I mean, there is very little research on this. I mean, at least the quantity is much less than it is in the case of a number of other sort of standard virtues. So we would need to do a lot of digging down into people's actual moral psychology to know before we could sort of start to teach intellectual humility as a moral virtue, because we don't know where the mean is. Now, problems 5 to 8 are all about contextualization and individualization. I mean, in Aristotle, this is the key thing about the golden mean. It doesn't lie in the object, it lies in the person. It's relative to us. So temperance and eating is not the same for Milo the athlete and the novice athlete. It's not like a numerical calculation where 6 is at the middle point between 2 and 10. The mean is not the same for everyone. It's relative to us. And when it says relative to us, that refers to personal constitution, developmental level, social role, and cultural variance. And I think all these issues create problems for understanding of intellectual humility as a moral virtue, because we simply don't know much about most of them. And this is especially because of problem 3, lack of paradigmatic cases, and problem number 4, where we don't know where actually where the mean is, whether it's closer to the excess or deficiency. So if we begin with the personal constitution part, so the Greeks had no term for personality traits or modern understanding as distinct from character traits. But given what we know about the big 5 traits, it's possible to hypothesize that intellectual humility as a virtue will manifest itself differently for the introvert and for the extrovert. So when we judge somebody to be intellectually humble or not, we have to judge it compared to the person's personality profile. I mean, intellectually humble or not as an extrovert or as an introvert. And other personality traits may also matter in evaluations of individual intellectual humility, like openness. And remember that many of those traits are more or less constant or genetic as opposed to character traits. A special problem is created for people on the autistic spectrum, because of their limited emotional repertoire and emotional intelligence, we may wonder whether it's fair to evaluate them at all with Aristotelian virtue constructs. This is a point in a really nice article by Katie Deneen in 2019. So in any case, we need to know quite a lot about personal constitution and the person's Big Five profile before we can start to ascribe intellectual humility to the person, because the humility would be relative to the person's intellect, to the person's personality profile. Developmental level is another issue. So Aristotle says that moral virtues are also relative to developmental levels. Some virtues are only virtues for people at certain developmental levels, such as emulation, which is only a virtue for the young, not for the old. And even for virtues that apply to all ages, how we identify them and evaluate them depends on the person's characterological or developmental level. So this creates a problem for intellectual humility because of the complex interactions between this problem and the problem of personal constitution. So just to take an example from my own life, 25 years ago, I wrote 10 articles in a literary review in Iceland about the stupidity of postmodernism. And it was very, very arrogant. It was very sort of, as I say, acrimonious in a way. And I regret it now to have written it in this way. If I wrote it today, I mean, definitely it would count as lacking in intellectual humility. It was arrogant, it was cynical, it was dismissive, it was acrimonious, like I said. Now, there are two interpretations of this in the context of Aristotle's account of moral virtue being relative to developmental level. You could say that it was written when my testosterone levels were much higher than they are today. So as a young man, I mean, you expect young men to be, you know, more aggressive than middle-aged or older gentlemen. Or you could interpret it in a different way and say that this was even less intellectually humble now than it would be today, because I was less developed as an academic and should have been even more humble at that time. So there are two different ways to sort of interpret this, but we need to interpret it in some way, because we can't just say that somebody is intellectually humble or not. We have to say, given that person's developmental level. Yeah. So clearly, people who are evaluating intellectual humility, at least as a moral virtue, they have to be very well versed in developmental psychology. And again, we just don't have the evidence for this. I mean, how intellectual humility sort of expresses itself at different developmental levels. Social roles. This is another relativity of the golden mean. So Aristotle talks a lot about role-dependent virtues, giving examples of statespersons, doctors, craftsmen. Some virtues are exclusively dependent on certain social roles and resources, such as magnificence is only a virtue for rich people. I mean, doesn't apply to the poor. They just can't be magnificent in giving. Now, regarding intellectual humility, again, problem. An academic who goes into politics will have a greater warrant for boosterism than she had at academic conferences. So if I decided to run for parliament, I mean, you would probably expect me to talk in a very different way about me and my own sort of qualities than you would expect me to do at a philosophy conference. Even within academia, there may be different criteria for intellectual humility as a moral virtue in different disciplines. What counts as being intellectually humble at a philosophy conference may be seen as arrogant at a psychology conference, for example, where people tend to be more sort of measured in how they present their views. So an appraisal of the social context is crucial for the correct identification of intellectual humility. And then cultural variance. Again, Aristotle was very well aware of this in the politics when he talks about the civic virtues. For some reason, he's much less aware of that in the Nicomachean when he talks about the moral virtues. He seems to be sort of fairly naively universalist about moral virtues in Nicomachean ethics, which is a bit strange, but probably explained by the fact that he simply had no particular interest in or knowledge about all the cultures. Although he does make this offhand remark, though, about people living in Northern Europe, obviously not being able to think clearly because the weather is too cold. But I mean, apart from remarks like that, I mean, what he says about cultural relativity and the Nicomachean is almost non-existent or fairly naive. But he's very, very well aware of this in the politics, so strangely enough. Now, of course, we know a lot of research already in social psychology about difference between independent and interdependent cultures, and we would clearly need to assess intellectual humility differently, for example, in Japan versus the USA. And Igor Grossman has written about this in the context of wisdom and intellectual humility as well, and talk about it as being culturally relative. So we need a multiculturally sensitive account of intellectual humility to be able to say something really worthwhile about it as a moral virtue. So again, simply we just don't have the empirical evidence, although we probably have a little bit more of it in this case than we do in the case of personal constitution and the other factors. Finally, the last two problems are practical problems about education and measurement. Now, obviously Aristotle says that talking about moral virtues just intellectually and figuring out what they mean, etc., that has no value in the end unless you can do something with it, you can use it to educate, etc. So, but he also says that education of the virtues is extremely difficult because it has to take account of all these variables that I mentioned earlier, and it has to be generated towards the individual. We don't impose the same fighting on everyone, as he says, for the boxing instructor. Now, without the recourse to the paradigmatic cases, as we have in the case of maybe courage and compassion and etc., we don't have those, I think, in the case of intellectual humility in the same way. We don't have widely acknowledged moral exemplars of intellectual humility. So the original baseline is hardly clear enough to craft educational interventions. Without knowing where the mean of the virtue lies in general, whether it's closer to the excess or a deficiency, we cannot apply the straightening bent wood principle. We cannot drag students away from the extreme to which they are more prone if we don't know to which extreme they are more prone. Without knowing about the individualized variables, I mean, how intellectual humility expresses itself in the extroverted person and the introverted person and so on, we cannot really educate the individual student well in intellectual humility either. Now, problems 5 to 8 are much the same for other virtues in character education, but I think problems 3 and 4 make this task even harder in the case of intellectual humility. We need a lot of empirical psychological research and measurements of all these numerous variables. Finally, the 10th problem is the problem of measurement. A lot has been written about measurements of intellectual humility, but most even understood as an intellectual virtue. And again, a really good overview in the Porter article. I think one of the co-authors is here today, at least. I saw Aranda somewhere earlier. If we want to understand intellectual humility as a moral virtue also, we need to take other considerations into account on how to measure multi-componential psychomoral constructs. And obviously quite a lot of general writings about that have appeared recently, for example, in the Wright and Snow book on understanding virtue, and in our recent work on how to measure phronesis, and then also in the Fowers 2024 book on the science of virtue. So I think the first step in understanding the role of intellectual humility as a moral virtue would be to figure out how it relates to flourishing, because I mean, the ultimate criterion in Aristotelian virtue ethics for the value of a potential moral virtue is how well it promotes human flourishing. And we recently been doing quite a lot of work in the Jubilee Center. We haven't published it yet, but we've been working with huge data sets looking at the relationship between phronesis and flourishing, and we have managed to find a very, very strong correlation between phronesis and most of the components of flourishing. So you would have to do something similar with intellectual humility then, if we want to really understand it and measure it as a moral virtue as opposed to an intellectual virtue. We need a lot of research on how it relates to flourishing and how it relates to other moral virtues as well. So there are extensive theoretical discourses and empirical studies about intellectual humility and general wisdom already, but very little about phronesis and flourishing and intellectual humility. And I mean flourishing as understood, for example, in the Harvard 2017 Van der Wiele model. We would have to look at how intellectual humility contributes to flourishing on that understanding if we want to understand it as a moral virtue. Now, finally, just a few words about modesty. So I'm working on a paper on modesty at the moment. Not intellectual modesty in particular, but modesty in general. And sort of my general take on modesty in that paper is to say that to possess the virtue of modesty, you need the virtuous emotion of humility, but you also need certain presentational features, behavioral features to turn the emotion, the virtuous emotional attitude into a full-blown moral virtue. And it's quite a complicated task because modesty is a lot about sort of good manners and etiquette and politeness, not only sort of what philosophers tend to refer to as morals, but also about manners. So it's a complicated task, but it's sort of a field where I feel more at ease with or at home in, because obviously modesty is a standard, can be understood very easily as a standard moral virtue with behavioral sort of presentations, not only attitudes or approaches or beliefs or emotions. Right, so just to show you sort of the main references that I used in this presentation, I would be quite happy to, if you just drop me an email to send you a copy of the PowerPoint. Quite a lot of stuff in this PowerPoint presentation. Maybe I went through it a bit too quickly, but anyway, like I said, happy to share the PowerPoint. And for those of you who are not sort of experts on intellectual humility, just like I wasn't really an expert before I was asked to give this presentation, the sort of the readings that helped me most was the Ballantyne recent work on intellectual humility paper. It was the Gregg and Mahadevan paper on intellectual arrogance and intellectual humility. And then obviously the Porter overview. And then of course the sort of the classic article by Alessandra herself in 2018 on intellectual humility as an attitude. The rest of the references are sort of more general references about moral virtue and the problem we face when we want to fit a potential character trait like intellectual humility into this really, really complex architectonic of moral virtue in Aristotle, which requires so much empirical background knowledge about how people are, what people believe, how people behave before we can figure out what is the golden mean and before we can start to craft any educational intervention. So I think I'll stop there. I think I've spoken for about 50 minutes.
Thank you so much, Kristján. So what we are now going to do is it's 15:22. I suggest we take a break for 3 minutes and we'll start again at 3:25 for the Q&A, where we have plenty of time for questions. We are now going to stop the recording and I'll see you all in 3 minutes time. Thank you again, Kristján.